Well, happy Easter. I want to say happy Easter to the folks over in our new chapel and over there. So I'm going to try something out here this morning in the chapel. And actually, I'm going to go with I want to say happy Easter, everybody in the gathering place. We got folks in two places this morning. So here's a famous saying on Easter. We say, Christ is risen, and the response is, Christ is risen indeed. So let's try it. But I just want to hear from the chapel and the gathering place this morning. All right, let's see how we do. So for you in the chapel and gathering place, Christ is risen. All right, yeah. And let's see here in the Spirit Center, Christ is risen.
Christ is risen indeed.
All right, this is a way to start Easter, isn't it? All right. Well, I'm going to tell you a story that occurred. There was a captain standing on the bridge of an U.S. aircraft carrier. And it was nighttime, and he was looking out over the horizon, and he saw a light on the horizon. So he had his radio operator make contact. So here's what the U.S. ship sent this message. Please divert your course 0.5 degrees to the south to avoid a collision. Reply, recommend you divert your course 15 degrees to the south to avoid a collision. U.S. ship captain, this is the captain of a U.S. Navy ship. I say again, divert your course. Reply, no. I say again, you divert your course. U.S. captain, this is the aircraft carrier USS Coral Sea. We are a large warship of the U.S. Navy. Divert your course now. Reply, this is a lighthouse. Your call. I love that story. I've used it before. It actually comes from a military magazine. It's a story that's been being told since the 90s. It's not a true story, by the way. It's actually sometimes told as between the U.S. aircraft carrier and a lighthouse in Canada. And I think the Canadians like to tell that joke, but that's just my opinion, my theory. But anyway, it's not a true story, but it's been published in a magazine, and so people have accepted it as true over the years. But what we see in that is a great illustration of a power struggle, right? I mean, there's power, right? I'm the captain of a U.S. Navy ship. I'm in charge. I've got all this military power behind me. And when it comes to a lighthouse, though, who has absolute power, right? That there comes a point where someone has absolute power, and absolute power ultimately wins. And we don't always like to think about absolute power because we have some ideas about absolute power and giving people absolute power, and we know the problems with that. But I want to talk today about this idea of power and how we use power and how God uses power, because they're much different. Actually, we see in this week of Easter, if we looked back over this week of Jesus before the resurrection, we see a lot of use of human power to try and get rid of Jesus. I mean, the religious leaders were constantly questioning him. You know, every time he went to preach, they would show up at church and ask these questions to kind of bait him and trap him into saying something that they didn't like, to kind of come up with something to kind of get rid of him. And then they went to one of his beloved disciples, Judas, and they bribed Judas with 30 pieces of silver to get him to betray Jesus. And that night when they were in the Garden of Gethsemane, Judas betrayed Jesus with a kiss in the darkness with the Roman guard and the temple police, and that kiss was a way to identify which one of them was Jesus. So one of the disciples couldn't step up and say, no, I'm Jesus, or I'm Jesus. And so that arrest happened. So they were willing to bribe and pay a lot of money to betray Jesus. Then after they put Jesus on trial in the religious leadership, they then changed the charges. They trump up the charges and sent him off to Pilate in hopes that Pilate would crucify him, because the Roman government were the only ones that had the authority to bring about the death penalty or crucifixion. And so you can see in this Easter week that humans, religious leaders, were willing to go to great lengths to try and get rid of Jesus. They were using their political power. They were using their power to manipulate, to corrupt, to change things, to get something done about Jesus. Now, the other thing is that Matthew's writing this gospel that we heard read this morning 30 years after the resurrection. And for the past 30 years, there's been a rumor going around that the disciples stole the body. And so he's addressing that rumor in the gospel. And he's saying, well, there was a guard at the tomb, and that guard was bribed as well. So it's not so surprising that the people who bribed Judas, the people who twisted and manipulated Pilate, would also bribe the Roman guard to have the Roman guard say, hey, we didn't see anything, right? And they paid them off as well. And so Matthew's trying to address this rumor about the guards. Now, notice that 30 years later, the rumor is not, hey, we found the body. The body's still missing. The rumor's still floating around that the disciples stole the body, and so there's still an empty tomb. And the religious leadership, nobody's come up with a body to this point. And so this rumor's still out there. And so Matthew's addressing it. Now, for the disciples to steal the body is highly unlikely for a couple reasons. First of all, where are the disciples at this point in the event? The first place that the disciples are is the disciples at the moment that they're in the Garden of Gethsemane and Jesus is arrested, they run away and hide. They're in fear. They're in hiding. Why are they hiding? What are they afraid of? Well, they're afraid of being crucified as well. See, crucifixion was a pretty common day practice by the Roman government. This was something that happened often. They had seen this before. This is not their first time. How many people have ever heard the name Spartacus? Right? Spartacus, right? Now, Spartacus was a gladiator, a slave of Rome, and he led a gladiator and slave rebellion against Rome. Thousands of slaves and other gladiators joined him in fighting against Rome and leading a rebellion. They won a couple battles, but they were up against a professionally trained, professionally armed Roman soldiers and Roman army. And then they lost. And that army was captured. And do you know what Caesar did to that army of Spartacus? He had every single one of them, 6,000 of them, crucified. And then not only did he, to make it a public display, he had the crucifixion line a 125-mile road from Rome to another city in Italy. So if you walked that 125 miles, you would pass crucifixion after crucifixion after crucifixion after crucifixion for 125 miles, 6,000 people crucified. Who wanted to prove they had the power? Who wanted to prove absolute power? It was Rome. And so Rome used crucifixion as a way to bring the masses under control. And so if you're a disciple and your rabbi, your teacher and leader has been arrested and about to be crucified, are you going, hey, we're going to take those Roman guards on at the tomb? Remember, they only had one sword with them. So you're telling me 11 disciples, one sword, are going to go up against a Roman guard, multiple Roman soldiers, well-armed, well-trained at the tomb. And so they come up with this unlikely scenario. Well, they fell asleep. Well, if you fall asleep as a Roman soldier, you know what they do to you if you fall asleep? Right? You're executed for dereliction of duty. There was no wavering here in the Roman government. There was no, real leniency, I would say, in the Roman government. And this is the kind of power they're up against. This is the kind of power that they're facing. And so if I were a disciple, I'd be hiding. I'd be nowhere around. Peter was at least bold enough to show up at the trial, but then he denied knowing Jesus. And so this is the state of the disciples. The other thing I noticed from the other Gospels, if you haven't read all the Gospels about the resurrection event, is how many grave robbers do you know that fold clothes when they steal a body? Now, literally, they didn't fold them, but when they came to the tomb, the strips of linen were taken off of the body, and the headpiece that covered the head of the body was folded and laid to the side. Now, if I'm trying to steal a body under Roman guard, am I going to go in, hey, let's unwrap this, they're asleep, don't worry about it, and then take everything and then carry the body out without the guard? No, you're going to get out there as quickly as possible. You're not going to worry about garments. You're not going to worry about burial shrouds. You're going to get out of there as quick as you can. And so this story, this rumor, is a very highly unlikely scenario. And yet, that's the great lengths that human power and corruption will go to cover something up. The bottom line is, the tomb's empty. The body still has not been recovered. And so we're left with this historical fact of an empty tomb. Whether or not we believe in the resurrection is a matter of faith and a basis on the eyewitness testimony of the disciples. By the way, those same disciples, when asked to say it didn't happen, many of them were tortured, killed, crucified themselves, and imprisoned for their belief in the resurrection. So you have to ask the question, how did these disciples who were afraid and in hiding go from not doing anything, not saying anything, denying everything, to we'll go to our deaths believing in this resurrection? Something changed them. And I believe it is that they saw the risen Christ. And if you think about it, this is about God's power in the face of human power. God's power always shows up in ways that we don't expect. I've noticed that about God. God shows up in ways, in subtle ways sometimes, in powerful ways, in ways we would not expect, and that's resurrection power. You know, think about it. If you subscribe to the theory of the Big Bang Theory, the creation of the universe, how much power did it take to create the universe? A lot of power. If you remember Big Bang Theory from your science class, they say that all that power was in one small point of light, the small as the head of a pin, smaller than my finger. That there was enough power in that one little point of light that it could create the whole universe, that something was created out of nothing. In fact, that's what Genesis talks about, that God created something out of nothing, out of darkness. And so if God could create something out of nothing, that God, of that kind of power, absolute power, right, could do that, resurrection, that's an easy day for God. That's a no-brainer for God. The God who creates the whole universe from the head of a pin, a single point of light, can certainly resurrect the human body. And that's our faith. That we believe in that God of power who can resurrect someone from the dead, and we can say Christ is risen. Just checking to see if you're awake. Stay with me on that one, by the way. So here's the thing with us. When we look at power, we don't like this idea of absolute power because we know this quote very well. And the quote is, "Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely." And so we don't like the idea of absolute power. In fact, we try and prevent it every way we can. I think we ought to rewrite that quote. Here's the way I would rewrite it. I would say, power corrupts humans, and absolute power corrupts humans absolutely. Because God's absolute power is always used for good. See, we humans use power for our own good. God uses absolute power for others, the good of others, the good of us, the good of those that he loves. So God's powers always match absolute powers always with good. Our human power tends to lead us to corruption because that's what we do with power. That's part of our brokenness. So I want to challenge your thinking on that a little bit because I believe that God's absolute power, like the lighthouse, always has the last word. God always has the last word in human history, in anything, and the resurrection is proof of that. Now, how many people, God's been doing this throughout biblical history. God's been doing this throughout American history, throughout human history, showing up in ways that seem miraculous. Any American history buffs here this morning? No, not a hand goes up. Maybe one. All right, thank you. Thank you. A few of us, right. Anybody know of George Washington? All right, there we go. I knew I'd get you all aboard, right? So George Washington's got the Continental Army, 19,000 troops in New York, on Long Island, as they say. I don't know if they said it that way back then. But they're in Long Island. They're up against the British Army. 32,000 British soldiers, well-trained, well-armed, against the Continental Army of 19,000 troops, not so well-trained, not so well-armed. Add in the Royal Navy that's coming up the Hudson River and up to the East River to encircle George Washington and the Continental Army. They had a battle, the largest battle of the Revolutionary War took place there in New York. We lost badly. 9,000 troops from 19. And so we lost that battle, that large battle, and at night they ceased the battle. And that night George Washington had to make a decision as to what to do next. And so he began to secretly and quietly retreat his troops back, the 9,000 that were remaining that he could get to retreat, 9,000 back across the East River into Manhattan and up into New York. And they began this retreat at night. And General Howe for some reason, did not go in and attack further. Now, some historians suggest that if General Howe goes after the Continental Army at that point, end of Revolutionary War, you and I are still British subjects. Maybe, probably not, hopefully, but that would have ended the war, right? That would have been it for the Continental Army. What happened that night and into that morning as the troops began to retreat, and by the way, George Washington was the last person to leave Long Island and step onto the ferry to take those troops across. He was the last person to leave. All the other troops went ahead of him. And he was the last person to leave. And what allowed that retreat to happen was, even though it was a sunny July day, when the sun came up that morning, a fog rolled in over that river and covered the escape of the American Continental Army to leave New York without the British knowledge, without the British Navy seeing, without the British General Howe's troops seeing. And in fact, the wind also shifted, which prevented the British Navy from sailing up the river. Coincidence? Miracle? Historians, George Washington and other historians, have called it a miracle. You know, that's the kind of stuff God does. I remember another group of people called the Israelites, and they were fleeing another dictator called Pharaoh, and a well-trained, well-armed army was attacking them, coming at them. Their backs were up against the Red Sea. They were not armed. They had no army. Here comes Pharaoh's army. Red Sea in the way. Where do we go? What do we do? And then God miraculously provided a way for them to cross the Red Sea and escape to safety. And it's like God takes these moments, these seemingly moments where there seems to be no way, where there seems to be all is lost, where the weakest and the most vulnerable are all of a sudden miraculously led in a new direction. Women show up at a tomb. Scared disciples become the great church, a worldwide church of Christ. That's the way God works. God's power, no matter how much you try and manipulate or corrupt or get around it, it just keeps there going. Like a lighthouse. You can try and change it all you want, but God's power remains. And the resurrection is proof of that. That God's power always wins, and it wins for good. And you know, God calls you and I to a new kind of power, that kind of power, but not the absolute power we think of. God actually calls us to a different kind of power, a new kind of power. You know, the disciples were gathered in that upper room the night before his crucifixion, and you know they were arguing. You know what they were arguing about? Who's going to be in charge? Who's going to have all the power when Jesus becomes king? When we take over the Roman government and Jesus takes the throne, who's going to sit at the right hand and who's going to sit at the left? Which one of us 12 are going to be the leaders? Which one of us are going to have the most power? Humans. Gotta love them. And they're debating this. And here's what Jesus said to them. He said, the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors, but not so with you. Rather, the greatest among you must become like the youngest, and the leader like one who serves. And this new kind of power is saying, this power, God's power, if you take it on, there's power in serving. There's power in sacrificial love. That's the cross. There's power in generosity. There's power in forgiveness. It's a different kind of power. But I want to suggest to you that that kind of power is more powerful than the other kind. How many people have seen a life change because of sacrificial love? How many people have seen a life change because of generosity? How many people have seen a heart changed or a relationship changed because of forgiveness? How many of us have seen somebody change because of an act of service? Because that kind of power changes us on the inside, changes who we are. The Roman kind of power, the religious leaders' kind of power, was manipulative, and they used fear. And that changed outward behavior for a season. But it never changed anybody on the inside. And that's the way God's power works. There's still some stones that God can move right here. There's still some resurrection that can happen right here. There's still some new life that can happen right here. Because that's the way God's power works. I want to just close and share with you this prayer that was written for pastors this week by a Christian author named Brian McLaren. I'm not going to read the whole prayer, but just the part that's the part I like. But he's saying that God's power has the last word. God's power has the last word. Here's the prayer. Resurrection is a reminder that death is not the last word. Violence is not the last word. Hate is not the last word. Money is not the last word. Intimidation is not the last word. Political power is not the last word. Condemnation is not the last word. Betrayal and failure are not the last word. No. Each of them are like rags in a tomb. And from that tomb arise Christ alive. Christ is risen.
Christ is risen indeed.
Amen.
We thank you that it is in His life and in His death and in His resurrection that we have come to put our hope and our faith and our trust this morning. And to be reminded of your great love for us and how far you were willing to go to love each of us. And so may we be people, Easter people, who proclaim that Christ is risen, and that Christ has not only risen physically, but that Christ has risen in our hearts. We thank you that you have given us this gift this morning, and we celebrate together as your people. In Jesus' name.